All right, open your Bibles to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. Also, if you're new with us, you should know that we do the preaching first so that it might inform our worship at the end of the service. And so we'll do a time of worship through singing at the end of the service. Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 32, is where we'll be looking. Now, in our study through Mark, we see another side of the biblical Jesus today. We've been looking for a biblical Jesus, not one that we would cut and paste for ourselves, because that Jesus is powerless and can't save, because ultimately he doesn't exist. Only the Jesus of the Bible ultimately and truly exists. And so we want to discover him, we want to find him, we want to see him for who he is. Now, in today's episode, we see the Jesus who serves. And we've certainly seen elements of this, haven't we? But we're going to see Jesus' ultimate act of service, and for the first time, we're going to be given meaning for why he will serve in this way. He's already been talking to his disciples now, 2 different times, about the fact that he's going to die. He's a king, yes, he's the Messiah, but he's the Messiah who's going to go, to his throne by way of a cross. And so this is just kind of blowing up the paradigm, if you will. Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. The text is always better than what I would say. Anyway, so here we go. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. And Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed. And those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they became indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This passage begins with Jesus having set his face towards Jerusalem, as Jesus having resolved to go to the place that he is ultimately going to meet the end of his life. So on his way to Jerusalem, the Scripture says that his disciples were amazed and afraid. Jesus was walking up in front of them, and so they're kind of hanging back a little bit, talking and about this or that, things that Jesus has said, things that he's done, about what seems to be a building tension, if you will. If you've ever been around someone who's grown kind of somber, especially somber because of something that they have to do, something they have to do that's not very exciting to think about. It's not something that they want to do, but they have to do and they're resolved to do. If you're around those people, you sense a seriousness, don't you? There's kind of a tension that begins to build. I think of it in just the tiniest of ways whenever I know I have to discipline one of my children. And there's been some disobedience, maybe some outright act of rebellion, some treason in the home, and I've got to deal with this, and so I don't want to do this. enjoy doing this at all, but there's a sense of seriousness and tension that actually builds and kind of fills up the whole home. All the kids know something's up. I mean, they're all kind of standing straight at attention, going, man, what's going to be happening next? Because that tension is kind of felt by everyone. Well, Jesus is resolved to do something that is bitter in his thoughts at least. And so these individuals are amazed and they're afraid. Now, this amazement might come for one reason, because Jesus has just absolutely exploded the paradigm from last week's sermon. He's just exploded the paradigm for how they understand the world works. Jesus has just said that wealth is not an indicator of blessing from God. In fact, sometimes wealth, quite often wealth, is a great obstacle to seeing our need for God. We do not have any sense of real reliance on God because we've got all the things that we need as wealthy individuals. And so wealth can often get in the way of things when they've always understood that wealth is the blessing of God on the obedient. And so maybe they're amazed that he's just kind of collapsing their worldview one pillar at a time, and one more pillar has been collapsed. Or maybe they're amazed because why is he going to Jerusalem? Why is he going to Jerusalem? I mean, this is the den, right? This is the den that the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests hail from. These are the people who have been opposed to Jesus from the very, very beginning. So why is he going to Jerusalem? And so there might be an amazement and then a fear that also begins to characterize them, because they can imagine this isn't going to go well. This isn't going to go well. I mean, we've been accosted by 2 or 3 Pharisees at a time, maybe 6 or 7, but we're going to walk right into the hotbed where there are hundreds, maybe thousands of these individuals who are part of the religious elite. And so fear characterizes the disciples as they approach Jerusalem. Now, Jesus speaks into their amazement and into their fear by repeating what he's now said several times. We're going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to die. Something that they're still really struggling to come to terms with. It seems as if they are living in denial. They are pushing this idea. He's already talked about this 2 different times, and they're pushing this to the extreme ends of what they know and their cognizance. They're pushing it to the outside so they don't have to deal with it. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to ask what it means or any of these kinds of things. But Jesus begins to talk about it again. He says some things here that he hasn't actually said previously when talking about his suffering. This time he says that it's actually going to be Jerusalem where things are going to unravel before your very eyes. I will be brutally treated, murdered, and rise again. So he's expanding on some of the things that he's said before. In fact, he even says that he's going to go through, he's going to be condemned to death, which means he's going to go through the system of jurisprudence. He's going to go through the court system. He's going to be found to be guilty of heinous crimes deserving of death, and they're going to put him to death. But even before he dies, he says they're going to mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. He hasn't said anything about this until now. So he's speaking clearly about these things that are the sort of things that are part of the cup that he's going to drink. Now, at this point, James and John are prompted by their mother, which Matthew records. Okay, Mark doesn't record it, but Matthew does, that they're ultimately prompted by their mother to ask this unconscionable question. In fact, if I'm given the book of Mark and it's written all the way up to verse 34 of chapter 10, and I'm asked to write, what do you think will happen next? And I have 100 chances to write what I think will happen next. I'm not picking what this text says at all. It doesn't even begin to compute in my brain that they could ask a question like this, but they did. They asked Jesus, we would like for you to do whatever we ask. And that's a great way to start a prayer, isn't it? God, will you promise to do whatever I ask? We wish it worked out so easily as that, right? I think there's some part of James and John that knows they shouldn't be asking this question. some part of James and John that knows this isn't the right question, it's not the right place, not the right time, whatever. They have a problem with this question, so they actually try to get Jesus' agreement before they ask the question that he'll give them what they want. They're probably even thinking, if you'll remember, James and John, along with Peter, are usually the inner circle of Jesus, right? They're the ones who went up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They got to see Jesus glorified. They're the ones who would later be taken into the Garden of Gethsemane. They're the ones, it seems, that are always kind of pulled to the side. But this time, minus Peter, who's kind of always the big mouth, this time they're going to get some words in themselves. And so they leave Peter at the back of the pack for one reason or another, and they approach Jesus and ask him this question. And they probably think, maybe, because they're part of Jesus's close posse, that maybe there's some sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Entitlement. You should give us what we ask, Jesus. Well, regardless of their motives and regardless of what they were thinking, in verse 36, Jesus doesn't try to correct their thinking. Again, I'm always amazed sometimes at the things Jesus doesn't say. Not just the things that he says, not the things that he actually deals with, but sometimes the things that he doesn't say. Last week, right, to the rich young ruler who had said, I've kept all of the commandments since my youth. Jesus didn't say, liar. Let me show you all the ways that you've broken the commandments. He just simply accepted what he said and then moved on with his line of thinking. So to hear Jesus doesn't try to correct them, he doesn't say to them, how dare you ask me a question like that? Who do you think you are? Do you know who I am? He doesn't do any of those things. Because he's always so gracious. He's always just so gracious. So unbelievably patient, isn't he? All the way through this episode, we see Jesus bearing with them in their immaturity. Bearing with them in their immaturity. Just days from now, he's going to be sitting with the 12, eating or having just instituted the Lord's Supper, communion. And you know what conversation breaks out around the table after communion? Who's the greatest? And Jesus continually bears with, is patient with, is long-suffering with the immaturity of his followers. I think there's a real lesson for us in this. I think there is a real lesson for us in this. How quickly do we get annoyed when people say things and do things that we think are ridiculous, especially in terms of spirituality, especially in terms of the gospel and understanding grace and these kinds of things? How quickly do we get annoyed with people? And we're not patient and we're not very forbearing quite often. Jesus has been with these guys for 3 years. I want you to just kind of follow with me here. Jesus has been with these men for 3 years, and I think we would all agree, right, that Jesus is the master teacher. He didn't sit in Sunday school having to listen to, or let me say this, Jesus' teaching is not like us having to sit in Sunday school and listen to the pathetic teachers who tried to teach us something growing up, right? Jesus is the master teacher. So if the level and quality of teachership is what's necessary to create robust and mature believers in their spiritual and gospel understanding, then all of these men should have had PhDs in gospel, right? They should have really, really got it because Jesus is the master teacher. They should have understood, but it wasn't the case. And so Jesus patiently puts up with unreasonable immaturity. He puts up with unreasonable immaturity. He gives them grace in the form of patiently putting up with them in love. How well do you do that? How well do you put up with very immature, ridiculous, unreasonable kind of statements and thinking? And how well do we give grace to those who don't understand what we might understand? And if we aren't gracious to them, if we aren't patient with them, do we really understand so well as we think we do? If we elevate ourselves as more righteous than others because we understand, because we get it, because we're more mature, because we've worked it out better, if we stand in judgment over these people, then how well do we really get what we think we get? Do we really understand what we think we understand? How ironic and sad for those of us who have received so much grace to judge those who have not received what we have received. Remember, it's all a gift. Do we remember that? Do we really? Don't we think we have achieved? We've understood, we've grown, we've matured, and we have forgotten to understand all of this as grace, as favor from the hand of the Lord. And the saddest part of this irony for me is that I've so often judged others in the same way. I've been so very much more righteous than others because my theology is better than theirs. My method of parenting is better. The way I handle this or that or whatever. For you, it might be the way you handle money, and so because of that, you're more righteous than those who just blow their money so quickly, or you're more righteous than them because you have a better work ethic, or whatever it is. Jesus has every reason to come down on them extremely hard because he is indeed more righteous than they. Right? And he gives them grace. He gives them grace. I'm so very righteous sometimes. How about you? Are you often righteous? So much more righteous than others? How often I've needed the Holy Spirit to come and teach me about grace all over again. Maybe you do too. And so Jesus asks, what do you want me to do for you? Instead of correcting them, instead of letting them have it, what would you like for me to do for you? Verse 37, they ultimately say, grant us recognition. Grant us the seats of significance. Grant to us the positions of power and authority. We've never really been much of anything. We want to be somebody. Jesus has to respect this kind of ambition, right? Oh, goodness. No, he doesn't respect this kind of ambition. They want to sit on his right and his left when he comes into glory. But you know what they don't understand? They don't understand the greatest hour of Jesus' glory. What was the greatest hour of our Lord's glory? Was it not the cross? Where Jesus was lifted up, as John 6 says. He's going to be lifted up. This would be his chief and his primary hour of glory, when he would become nothing, when he would surrender himself to be brutalized by mankind. This was the hour of glory for Jesus. They want to sit at his right and his left. They didn't understand this greatest hour of glory, which would be the cross. And so in verses 38 and 39, Jesus basically says, you've lost your mind. You can't even begin to imagine what you're asking. If you want to sit in those seats, an agonizing baptism is required. You'll be baptized into everything that I am baptized in. You'll be immersed into everything, the agony, the suffering, the abandonment, all of these kinds of things. This is what you'll experience if you want to sit in those seats, but those seats aren't mine to grant. They're for those whom they've been prepared for already. Now, the way Jesus is going to go about defining greatness from here on out makes us think that maybe it's probably Moses, maybe it's John the Baptist, those who have suffered so inordinately, those who have given themselves in selfless service for so long. John the Baptist, called the greatest man who ever lived, right? Jesus said. Moses, the meekest man who ever lived, who gave himself in service selflessly to the people of Israel. So we don't know who gets to sit there. Maybe it's Moses, maybe it's John the Baptist, but it's been prepared for someone. But then he says to them, you will be baptized in pain. You will be baptized in agony. You will drink the cup of suffering. Verse 41, what do the rest do? Well, they catch wind of this conversation. They hear what's going on, and they become indignant. They become indignant. They begin to bow up righteously because they can't believe James and John had the audacity to ask a question like this. The truth is, they all wanted those same positions of significance. James and John just had the guts to ask for it, or at least a mother who would push them hard enough to ask for it. Okay? Well, Jesus doesn't let them revel in this indignation for very long. He knows that the desire for significance is in all of their hearts. The desire for position and prestige is in all of their hearts. So in verse 42, Jesus begins to explain the culture of the world. The culture of the world they live in. It says, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Jesus says, you know the way the world works. You know where authority comes from. You know where position and prestige, you know what, you understand how this place works. In fact, it was because they understood the way the world works that they asked what they did. So he explains the culture of the world. The powerful and the important people rule and exercise authority over the rest. In our world, there's always been a class system of different distinctions, hasn't there? Always. In every culture, in every place, there is never equity across the board. There's always a system of class. Human greatness always exercises authority in the world's culture. It always demands to be served in the world's culture. What better way to illustrate this than through the popular show Downton Abbey? My second week in a row using an illustration from Downton Abbey. In the show, the Earl of Downton Abbey and his family are wealthy and significant people. They are powerful people. They're people to know. They're people to rub elbows with. They are great by human standards. They are served by the common class of people. The butlers, the maids, the footmen, the chauffeurs, right? And these are two very distinct classes of people, really with multiple classes even in between the two of them. Everyone seems to understand their place in the world very well. The rich and the powerful and the significant understand their place, the place of commanding servants. The servants understand their place as well, and they seem that this is the lot, they feel that this is the lot to which we have been born to. The servants are nobodies, and they're okay with it. Now, in the first season, one of the main characters, Matthew Crawley, he's more progressive, and he doesn't want to be served. He's part of a more independent age, the age that you and I live in. We don't need anyone to tie our shoes. The idea of another dude dressing me, that's weird. And he's like, I don't need help with this. I can do these kinds of things. He's part of this more independent age. This is the age that we live in. We don't need anyone serving us in this way. We can take care of ourselves. Now, in this independent age, we feel our significance by how independent we are. If I don't need anyone to serve me, if I don't need anyone to help me, that's how I understand my worth, my significance. Because I've got everything in line. Everything's taken care of. Got all the money we need, got all the, I can work, we can take care of ourselves. In the show Parenthood. Anybody watch Parenthood? Anybody watch that show? Nobody? Okay. Kay sheepishly raised her hand in the back. Tara and I started watching the show, and I have never seen a stupider group of people in my whole life. than in the show. In the sense, number one, that they want to find happiness without God, but secondly, that common sense seems to be completely absent from all of these people. But anyway, in the third episode, there's a daughter, a grown daughter, who moves back with her two teenage children to live with her parents. At one point, her old beater car that she's been driving for a long time, it looks like an old Chevette, I think, and it breaks down. And so her father and mother, that she's now living with her teenage children, offer. They've done well in life. Let us buy you a car. Can we buy you a car? Can we help you? Can we serve you? We love you. Absolutely not. I can take care of myself. I can take care of my children. I can take care of my family. I don't need help from you. In fact, she even goes to the point where she states that she's nobody if she has to get help from her parents. Need we remind her? You are living in their home. So her worth, her sense of worth is in her degree of independence. If I am independent, then I am somebody. If I can take care of myself, then I have succeeded. But if we put our worth in our independence, how will we ever stoop to serve others? If we refuse to be served, how can we then stoop to serve others? If we can't be served, we cannot truly and selflessly serve others. Now, you're going to hear me use this word for the rest of the morning, the idea of selfless service. You see, there is service, there is serving others, but it can be quite something different than selfless service. I can serve you in order to manipulate you to give me one thing or another. I can serve people as a means to an end. I want this thing. I know in order to get it, I've got to serve these people. So that's selfish service, not selfless. When we're serving to get something, even if we're serving to think, I need happiness, and happiness only comes if I serve others, so I'll serve so I can get happiness. That even that in and of itself isn't selfless service at the end of the day. Selfless service is to serve, to give, to offer, to yield, to submit oneself for the good of another person. This leads us into verses 43 and 44. Jesus says it's not going to be this way among you. You know how the great people in the world live their life. You know how the great exercise authority over those lower classes. But he says it's not so among you. But whoever would be great among you would be your servant. Jesus is turning things completely upside down. He's saying that the economy of the kingdom, the currency of the kingdom, the way of living in the kingdom is radically different than the way that you know in the world. And listen, we all know the way the world works because we live in it and we function according to its rules most of the time. And Jesus says for us, it's not so among you. Whoever would be first among you should be slave of all. He introduces a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about the world. We think when we read things like this, Jesus is so quirky, right? Oh, he's saying cute, cryptic kinds of things. Up is down, wealth is poverty. The first are last, the powerful are weak, the inside are actually on the outside, the lovely are the outcast. The generous are the poor, the great must serve, and now the king must serve through dying. But we can't understand the things that Jesus says as quirky. He's demonstrating a new way to be human. He's demonstrating a new way to be human. This new paradigm, this new way to be human is based on what he came to do, to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the foundation. Everything that Jesus will say, everything that he will ever say about service and about God's estimation of those who serve comes from this idea. Jesus would give himself a ransom for many. He would lay himself down for others who certainly did not deserve him in any shape or form. James and John come looking for significance, don't they? They come looking for position, a place of honor. But Jesus redefines significance. And in doing so, he shows us this new way to be human, this new way to live. Now, there's a critical key, and oftentimes when you read biblical text, you have to look for a particular key that unlocks the text a little bit so that we begin to understand it in more than just the face value. Because at the very base level, Jesus isn't ultimately simply talking about service. He's going deeper than that. The service of the kind that Jesus is talking about is something altogether different from what the world knows. This kind of service is about that great and mysterious magic that is deeper than anything you and I could ever even begin to fathom. You see, Jesus is fundamentally talking about love. Jesus is fundamentally talking about love. He's showing us what love does. He's showing us the way love demonstrates itself. It gives itself up in selfless service. It looks out for the benefit of another, no matter what it costs, no matter what it takes. Jesus is giving us a lecture on the deepest mystery, the most powerful magic. And you understand I'm using the word magic metaphorically, okay? To be truly and selflessly loving is to serve others. This is the big idea. If you want to know the point of what I'm talking about today, here it is. To be truly and selflessly loving is to serve others. That's the big idea. And Jesus describes it profoundly for us. To quote Philippians chapter 2, love is to think more highly of others than we do ourselves. I mean, you ever draw that out to its logical conclusions? Ever draw the implications of that out? For you to be more concerned that your brother's rent gets paid than yours. Do we ever draw those things out and understand the implications of things like to think more highly of another than we do ourselves? To quote 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we know as the love chapter, love does not seek its own. There's something very, very profound about the kind of service Jesus is talking about here. Love is not even in the pursuit of its own happiness. Later, Jesus demonstrates the ethic of selfless service when he washes his disciples' feet. Remember that? Jesus would have put himself through substitution in the place of the lowest of the low to demonstrate what true selfless love is. He would put himself at the very bottom of class society to demonstrate his greatness. In the foot washing, Jesus symbolizes the work that was only a few hours away, where he would need to wash the disciples in his blood for the cleansing of their sins. Peter said, well, you help me remember. What did Peter say when Jesus got around with the bowl and the towel to him? No, Lord. No, Lord, you can't wash my feet. I would never permit such a thing. But Jesus knows that if Peter can't be served, then Peter won't selflessly serve others. So Jesus says to him, if you don't allow this, you have no part in me. Because to have a part in me is to be a selfless servant. Jesus is teaching Peter how to love. He's teaching us how to love. True God-imparted love causes us to give ourselves to each other. God-imparted love frees us from self-centeredness. Jesus will serve humanity in order to free us up to serve others. To not be so concerned about what's mine and that I get mine. If we can't selflessly serve others, then we don't understand the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus in the first place. If you're always serving for what you get out of it, you can produce lots of things that look very, very good and religious. A long list of things that you could stand before God and say, see the list? See all the things that I've done? And hear those very tragic words, depart from me. I never knew you. Tim Keller says that all real, life-changing love is substitutionary sacrifice. All real, life-changing love is substitutionary sacrifice. Then we come to verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The word ransom to you and I means to pay a sum of money for the release of a hostage, someone who's been kidnapped, right? But to those who would have originally heard this, it meant that someone would be freed from slavery through the payment of a price, through the payment of some great sum. And we know that humanity is in slavery to sin, right? The scriptures are clear throughout. For Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. You are dead in trespasses and in sins. Death is a pretty good slave driver, isn't it? It doesn't ever get beat. On the cross, Jesus would effectively purchase the freedom of God's elect, those who were chosen before the foundation of the world. He would pay a ransom through a substitutionary sacrifice. He would put himself in their place. He would pay the penalty of their sin, and they would be forever freed. This was the one purest, most wonderful, most beautiful, selfless act that's ever been witnessed by the world. In C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this is demonstrated with incredible beauty when Aslan, the great lion, dies the death of the traitor Edward. Remember, he goes to the stone table and he is there penalized for Edward's treachery. He dies on the stone table, which is a symbol of the cross in the book. And to quote Lewis, when a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. That's what Jesus did on the cross. Jesus is teaching these men how to be free from selfish ambition, free from the death and tyranny of sin, free to love in ways that unravel the very hold of death on us, free to be truly significant, free to be truly great in the eyes of God. What is more important to us, that we would be great in the eyes of God, or that we would be great in the eyes of men? That we would be significant in the eyes of men, respected in the eyes of men. Jesus became the most significant person who's ever lived by dying as a criminal on a cross in your place. This is what makes Christianity so radically different than the religions of the world. You see, the other religions of the world, they have some good understanding of sinning against the God and the fact that the God has to dispense justice in some way. But none of the world's religions have a God who himself would pay the price. Allah would not pay the price to atone for his people. He would leave it to them to live obedient lives, to obey the 5 pillars of Islam, to be good enough, to ultimately try to pay back and atone for their own sins. Only in Christianity do we have a God who would come to meet us at our point of need, take the need on himself, and deliver. So you cannot hear this text. You cannot hear this text and think, Jesus is telling us that we need to be more humble. Certainly he is saying that. But if we leave it there, we have absolutely neglected the weightiest sense of this text. Jesus is showing us how to love. If you are not selflessly serving people, you are not demonstrating the love of God poured out in your hearts. Jesus is giving us an understanding of what love looks like in practice. Tell me that you love me. Tell me that you love me deeply. Tell me that you care for me so much. But if you will not serve me, how am I to understand your affection towards me as love? The truth is, my family recently has experienced the love of this body in ways that you have selflessly served me and my family. And so I understand and I feel that my church body loves me because you have demonstrated it in this way. Selflessly serving is love demonstrated. And this marks true greatness. This marks true greatness. The one who's always serving, always giving, always submitting, always yielding themselves up for the good of others is the one who is great in the eyes of God. I want to give you 4 implications of today's teaching, and as we think of how to transfer what we've learned here today into what will look like on Wednesday. 4 implications. The first 3 will go very quickly. Number 1, we must cultivate selfless service as individuals. Okay, that's just a clear implication from the text. We would all agree with that, right? We should cultivate selfless service as individuals. So this means that this starts at a personal level. It's not, you don't think about your church first, your family, you first. Are you demonstrating selfless service for your children, for your spouses, for other people in your family, for your neighbors, for people in your congregation? Are you personally selflessly serving, which means I'm not looking for anything in return. I do not need benefit from this at all. I am loving you so that I might see to your benefit, your welfare, your good. This is where it starts. Secondly, we must cultivate selfless service as a church. This means at the corporate level. At the corporate level, we cannot simply look out for the interests of our church. We must be concerned about the needs of others that are well beyond the walls of our church. This is why we have to take up the plight of those who suffer the ravages of storms, like the people in Adairsville did this past week, people in Calhoun. This is why we take up the concerns of other people who are suffering around us, because as a church, we must flesh out corporately the love of Jesus, which is selflessly serving those who are in need. Thirdly, we must selflessly serve the lost and needy in terms of gospel community. This is still a corporate aspect, but on a smaller level. This past Friday, the big idea that we presented, that I hope everybody went home with, is that you are a missionary and gospel communities are teams of missionaries. That's the big idea. So what would teams of missionaries do? What would teams of image bearers do? They would selflessly serve the neighborhoods that they are on mission to. That's exactly what they would do. In all kinds of ways. We would not only be making meals for the sick in our church, we would be making meals for the sick in our neighborhood. We would be loving people around us. We would be selflessly giving ourselves and as teams of missionaries to a neighborhood that we've covenanted to on mission. And the fourth thing We must teach our children the ethic of selfless service rather than self-seeking advancement. And the reason I drew this one out, James and John's mother. What a wonderfully ambitious woman, who wanted her children to sit at the right and left, who wanted her children to be somebody, so much so that she would goad them, push them, prod them, lead them to ask this kind of question. When Jesus has just said, I'm going to be mocked, flogged, spit on, and killed. I think the implications for this are huge. We must teach our children the ethic of selfless service rather than self-promotion, rather than self-advancement. And I think that the nature and the culture of this world infringes on us. It influences us far more than we can even begin to imagine, because we want to make sure our children can go to the right schools. We want to make sure that they make enough money, that they have the right titles, that they're in the right places, that they know the right people, that they live in the right home. We want to make sure that our children live their best life now. We mock the title of the book, don't we? But isn't it what we're up to more than we think? To make sure they have all the best opportunities so they can advance, so they can be promoted, so they can be liked by the right people and put in the right schools. Why is this ethic of selfless service so repugnant to us? Well, two reasons, really. Nature and nurture. You've heard these arguments, right, when you think about parenting and different issues. Here's what I mean by these two things. First, you need to understand that every one of your children are born with a sin nature. They are little devils come out of the womb. They are depraved in their hearts. It's always so funny when I'm talking to a parent and they seem to be so blown away that their children are selfish. So surprised. And they're often reformed people, and I'm just like, you do under how this works? Okay. But anyway. In short, your children do not like selflessly serving others because their hearts are negatively disposed towards it. They want what's theirs now. And you know what? Those little children grow up to be us. And so we're so negatively disposed towards selfless service because maybe we did or maybe we didn't have somebody who was really teaching us what it means to selflessly serve someone else. We were being taught, and others are being taught, how to get what you want, to make this, to get in this place, to achieve this position, get this degree, do this thing. So nature is one, but nurture is another, which I really just kind of hit on a little bit. Parents nurture their children in a race for self-advancement. We put so much time into raising our children to become significant, or at least to have a great life here. We're like James and John's mother, aren't we? Let me ask you a question, and I'd like you to take this home and meditate on it. I'd like you to take this home and think about it. So many of you have young children, and you have many wonderful years, incredible opportunity to train your children up in the way they should go. So consider this. Where will you spend the majority of your time with your children? Teaching them to be great in the eyes of God through selfless service. Taking every opportunity to teach your children the gospel of Jesus and how to live out and flesh out the example that Jesus has so abundantly laid out for us in his own ransoming death? Will you teach your children to be great in the eyes of God, or will you teach your children to be ambitious for advancement in the world, to have a great life now. Where will you spend your time? Certainly we need to educate our children and raise our children to have a good work ethic and to work hard, to provide. And we need to raise our children to do all those things are good things. But if we are not pouring time and attention into teaching our children how to be selfless servants, then they won't be. They won't be. You see, the gospel is about the unconditional acceptance of men before a holy God because of the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus. The gospel is all of what Jesus does to save us, to make us acceptable before God. Greatness, however, is conditional in the eyes of God. Acceptance is accomplished by Jesus on the cross, but greatness in the eyes of God is conditional. You may be accepted by God because of Jesus, but you're great in the eyes of God if you follow the example of selfless service that Jesus set for you. Now we know, according to Philippians chapter 2, verse 11, that it is God who is at work in us, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. We know that all glory and praise and honor go to God. And yet we are called, aren't we, to selflessly give ourselves up for each other. And this is how greatness is viewed. I want to impress on every parent that's here this morning, work that your children might be viewed as great in the eyes of God, rather than significant, important, respected, or anything of that nature in the eyes of men. Work that your sons and your daughters might be considered great by God, that they may give their whole lives pouring themselves out in service for other people. As I think about my own children, I have 6, and as I think about my own children, I think to myself, I'm only one, I'm not multiple personalities. I don't have dissociative identity disorder or any of those things. As I think to myself, how much time really do I spend teaching my children how to serve? If you won't give your children chores growing up and teach them the value of serving their home through doing chores, you're doing a great disservice to your children. If you will not give them things to do so that they can help and so they can see how these things work into the fabric of the home and the economy that God has set up in this world to determine greatness, if you will not teach them these things, then you do a great disservice to your children. I remember 2 teenage girls when I was a youth pastor, and both of these young girls, they were 17, 18 years old. They had never washed a load of clothes. They'd never washed the dishes. They'd never swept the floor. They'd never done anything in their homes. And I have never met 2 girls who had a greater sense of entitlement in my whole life. They expected everything to be done for them. Their mother had served them on hands and knees their whole life. Parents, teach your children not just serving. Teach them what it means to serve selflessly, what it means to look out for another person, what it means to love. Your children, if they become Christians, will stand at the judgment seat of Christ, and their works will be judged. They are saved, but their works will be judged. The text is clear, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Many things that we have done will burn up because they were of no repute, no regard. There was nothing good about them. And there are other things that the Bible says they will be tested in, and it will show the refined nature of those things. Those will be the selfless acts we did in this life. So are you going to pour more time into teaching your children how to have a great reward then or a great life now? They are quite often 2 completely and radically different things. James and John's mother, I'm afraid, was opting for the latter. So are you great in the eyes of God? I mean, probably none of us in here would go, yeah, that's me. I'm great in the eyes of God. Do you selflessly serve others? Does love take the form of willingly, selflessly giving yourself up to other people? Or when you serve, do you complain? Do you gripe? Do you say, this isn't my problem, I shouldn't be doing this? Or do you, well, how do you go about it? I think if most of us are honest, selfless service doesn't come easy to us. But what I hope ushers from this sermon out into Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this week and beyond is that we might begin to pursue greatness in the eyes of God, which is conditionally understood. Many graces of God are bestowed unconditionally. But some of God's graces are bestowed conditionally. James says God gives grace to the who? Humble. Which means that God's not giving so much grace to the arrogant and the prideful, right? Some of God's graces are conditional. And if we would be great in the eyes of God, if we would have our children be great in the eyes of God, then we must learn to selflessly serve others. Let's pray.